Well, hello everyone. My name is Ananta Sriram, and I will be speaking about the role of cytokines in COVID-19 today. So, introduction to COVID-19. So, severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, which is also called SARS-CoV-2, has become responsible for the massive COVID-19 pandemic that appeared in Wuhan, China, and began spreading all over the world beginning from December 2019. And thus far, there has been a mortality rate of 2.67%, which is definitely projected to being increasing over the next couple of months as well as probably years. And likewise, a majority of the COVID-19 patients have thus far been mainly adults who are older than 18 years old, specifically the elderly as well as those who are immunocompromised and have pre-existing conditions. And patients infected with COVID-19, despite having the virus in their body, have been shown to be asymptomatic or symptomatic with a cough, fever, or viral pneumonia causing ARDS, which is also called acute respiratory distress syndrome. And patients have been observed to have three phenotypes, the first one being mild, in which there are very minor symptoms, the second one, which is moderate, in which there is a need for hospitalization, and the third one, which is severe, in which the patient has ARDS. So, introduction to HCOVs. So, SARS-CoV-2 belongs to a group of viruses called HCOVs, which are single-stranded and are part of the Coronaviridae family. And HCOVs are spherical, have a crystal shape, and have a spike protein. And in the next slide, I will be talking about the significance of the spike protein, which really plays an important role in SARS-CoV-2 ability to infect cells as well as the effort in finding a vaccine against COVID-19. And in addition to this, HCOVs serve as mRNAs as they allow translation of replicase and transcriptase. So here is a picture that I drew about the spike protein mechanism. And so basically, many researchers searching for solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic have focused on the spike protein, which plays an important role in the virus's ability to bind to and infect healthy cells. And so as a background to this, glycans are actually sugar molecules that shield these spike proteins and are important for the viruses to thrive. And for example, the thick glycan shield around HIV-1 has been shown to allow the virus to survive despite the immune system response. And the SARS-CoV-2's spike protein enters host cells by locking its receptor binding domain, RBD, which is right here in red, to the ACE2 protein on the cell surface, the uninfected cell as of right now. So there is a binding relationship that goes on here. And the N-glycans linked to the spike protein, which is right here, at the sites N165 and N234, help to stabilize RBD's shape for subsequent infection. And deleting these glycans by introducing mutations at N165 and N234 significantly reduces its binding to ACE2, which basically prevents the virus from entering the cell and infecting the cell. And the spike protein's stalk, which fixes the RBD containing spherical head, which is right here, is densely covered by glycans, and that really makes it difficult to target with large molecules like antibodies. And in comparison, the head, which is right here, appears to be less shielded, indicating that it is an easier target. And it was really interesting to see that many of the vaccine trials around the world are basing their vaccine off of this spike protein by targeting this specific part of the spike protein that is not covered by the glycans as a protection method. And it was just interesting to add this in this PowerPoint because I just found it to be really interesting, and I hope that all of you do too. So, introduction to cytokines, which is really the most important part of this PowerPoint. Cytokines, which are essential in the inflammatory process, are made by macrophages, natural killer cells, dendritic cells, as well as B and T lymphocytes. And an innate immune response basically begins with PRRs, which are specific to the host, that recognize PAMPs, which are pathogen specific. And we definitely touched upon this point in the beginning of immunology earlier on in the semester. And so when PRRs bind to PAMPs, which is basically what they're supposed to do, the inflammatory response against the virus starts, and with PRR activation, the upregulation of cytokines occurs, which kind of leads it into the first cytokine wave, or the first wave in general. So here I outlined the COVID-19 immune response in basically 4 stages, and the first stage is the virus entry. Stage 2 is the innate immune response, which is the first cytokine wave. Stage 3 is the immunodeficient state, and stage 4 is the cytokine storm, which is basically the second wave. And that's the last stage. So stage 1 is the virus entry. And so basically here, when SARS-CoV-2 enters cells by binding its spike protein enveloped to the human angiotensin converting enzyme to HACE2, which is actually in the type 2 alveolar cells, it can infect these cells. And then CD147, which is another receptor, promotes SARS-CoV-2 entry into human cells by promoting endocytosis. And when the virus begins to replicate, the result really is endothelial and epithelial cell apoptosis, vascular leakage, as well as pro-inflammatory mediator release. And later on, SARS-CoV-2 infects T cells through S protein mediated fusion. And when HACE2 is downregulated and when the viral S protein is shed, inflammation increases even more to a greater extent. And the stage 2 is basically the first cytokine wave, and this is basically the innate immune response. And in this part, or this stage, the acute phase reactants, which are pretty much key in inflammation as we have learned, in patients like ESR, CRP, serum amyloid A, and ferritin are really increased. And alongside this, there is an increase in levels of major cytokines like TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, IL-1RA, SIL-2R alpha, IL-6, IL-10, and many more. And the non-like receptor family and NLRP3 are stimulated, which basically drives inflammation. And it was really interesting to think about this because as I was doing my research, I was able to learn that there's these things called NLRP3 blocker drugs that are being tested. And basically, by the name, NLRP3 blocker drugs are supposed to downregulate the amount of NLRP3. And so due to this, basically, inflammation can be minimized, and that can potentially serve as a potential treatment against COVID-19 infection in the future. And stage 3 is basically the immunodeficient state. And so in this state, PDCs increase the amount of TNF alpha and IL-6 cytokines, and PDCs are activated when they contact virally infected cells and when PAMPs are transferred to TLR7 through the interferogenic synapse process. And this synapse basically increases the amount of TNF alpha, which reduces viral replication. And likewise, delayed type 1 IFN causes immune cells to rush to the site of infection and cause the apoptosis of several different cells, which can ultimately lead to drastic effects like ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. And the last stage that I had here was stage 4, which is the cytokine storm, or which is also called the second wave. And so in this stage, there is an excess increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-1 beta, IL-1RA, IL-6, TNF alpha, and all of this really contributes to the second wave or the cytokine storm. And likewise, due to the damaged lung epithelial tissue and an immune system that's just tired of working so hard, the immune system is unable to combat the simplest of infections, like a bacterial infection. And likewise, the patient is enduring severe symptoms and is experiencing deterioration of health. And likewise, there are different many feedback loops, and one of them is a feed-forward loop in which that basically combines both IL-19 and IFN gamma. And so through that feed-forward loop, there is an activation of more macrophages alongside a cytokine release. And so now we can talk about some of the treatment strategies. And so many of these treatment strategies that I listed, or actually all of them, are targeting cytokines, and they're causing the downregulation of some of these cytokines. And as I stated, cytokines are pretty much important in this immune response because that is basically what is involved with, for example, the cytokine storm in the stage 4. And so by downregulating some of these cytokines, these drugs or treatments can promote some of these strategies to fight against COVID-19 infection. And the first one that I have is Anakinra, which is an antagonist of IL-1 beta, and that has been thought to potentially combat cytokine release syndrome symptoms such as fever, tiredness, diarrhea, and many more. And specifically in terms of COVID-19, Anakinra has been seen to decrease the need of invasive mechanical ventilation in the ICU and has promoted better pulmonary function. And the second one I have here is Toxolyzumab, which is kind of hard to say, honestly. But this treatment strategy can bind to membrane and soluble IL-6 receptors and can inhibit signal transduction. And its job is basically to reduce IL-6 levels, and that can therefore allow it to be used to treat severely ill patients who have extensive bilateral lung lesions. And the third one is Tnf blockers, which by their name decrease the amount of TNFs. And TNFs are basically cytokines that have been shown to promote acute lung injury. And then the fourth one is ulonistatin, which is pretty unique in its own way because not only does it decrease or downregulate some of these cytokines, but it also upregulates some of these cytokines. So therefore, ulonistatin can maintain a balance, so to say, between these inflammatory and anti-inflammatory responses and can definitely stand as a check method for the cytokine storms. And the fifth one that I have is chloroquine, which is basically downregulating TNF and IL-6, and MSC, which is involved in stem cell therapy, which has the potential to inhibit proliferation of pro-inflammatory T lymphocytes and also promote differentiation into T regulatory cells. And that's really a way for how MSC plays a role in anti-inflammatory mechanisms. And so this next slide I have here is really interesting because I was able to kind of make a drawing for all of you to show this COVID-19 mechanism and treatment strategies, of course, that I mentioned on the last slide. And so as we start off here, SARS-CoV-2 enters the cells by binding its spike protein envelope, which is right here, to the HACE2 enzyme, which is on type 2 alveolar cells. So it basically enters the alveoli, and then many inflammatory signals are sent, and then that allows the activation of many immune cells, which are dendritic cells, monocytes, macrophages, and many more. And alongside that is PR activation, and ultimately this and this combined really allowed the upregulation of some of these cytokines. And after that, the cytokine storm follows, and that could lead to more drastic effects like ARDS, multi-organ failure, hyperinflammatory syndrome, and many more. And here at the bottom, I kind of just labeled some of these treatment strategies that I mentioned in the last slide before. And many of these treatment strategies, as I mentioned, have been used or have been shown per se to downregulate some of these cytokines that are very essential in upregulating the cytokine storm mechanism here. But because these treatment strategies do downregulate some of these cytokines, they have the potential to maybe, after some research, to be used clinically to fight against COVID-19 infection. And so here I have the conclusion, and basically the massive spread of COVID-19 all around the world has made the need for a treatment very urgent at this time. But more than that, it has been really important for the fact that we really need to highlight that the immediate need is basically primary prevention against COVID-19, and that really means that we must follow the guidelines for public health as recommended by the CDC. And part of these treatment strategies past this primary prevention, which is basically things that we can all follow, like social distancing, wearing masks, just being more safe and cautious of our surroundings. Past all of that can come all those different treatment strategies that I mentioned, in which these cytokines can be really targeted, and the cytokine storm mechanism can be really targeted through some of this research that needs to be done in the field. And by targeting some of these cytokines and the cytokine storm, the search for treatment strategies as well as a potential vaccine has been ameliorated and is truly in the forefront in the battle against COVID-19 infection. Well, I hope that you learned some important, interesting concepts from my PowerPoint presentation. And if you have any questions, you can always reply to this post in YouTube in the comments section. And I thank you for listening to my presentation, and please subscribe to my channel.